They whispered, they mocked, they shamed her for something stolen from her. No man would ever want her, they said, until a quiet rancher walked through the jeering crowd and asked her to marry him. The first time June Harper heard someone say the word spoiled with her name behind it, she was 13 and hiding in the church loft. It was her cousin, Dora, whispering to some boy from out near Dry Creek. They were laughing. June didn't. Understand it then. Why the word tasted so bitter in their mouths. Why Dora had said it like it was filth, not hurt. But now, 8 years later, she knew exactly what they'd meant. And they were still saying it. It started again that morning, like it always did. Someone pretending not to stare, then pretending their whisper was just a joke, then pretending the hurt in her face was something imagined. June stood in the shade behind the mercantile, arms crossed tight over her chest, watching the dust swirl beneath a passing wagon. Her boots felt 2 sizes too tight, though they fit just fine yesterday, and the collar of her dress scraped at her neck like it resented being worn by someone like her. She knew she should have gone straight home after picking up the flower, but she'd lingered like a fool, just long enough for the trouble to start. "Well, look who's still showing her face," someone said. The voice came from behind, light, sing-song, syrupy sweet, the way a rattlesnake's rattle might be, if it wanted to play pretend. June didn't have to turn around to know it was Maybelle Cartwright. June moved to step away, but Maybelle sidled up beside her like they were old friends. "Town just don't learn, do it?" Maybelle said. "Letting girls like you wander around with the decent folk. Why, I bet the flour in that sack's cleaner than you are." Laughter sparked up around them. 3 girls and 2 boys, all from town, all circling her like coyotes around a wounded thing. June didn't say anything. Her fingers pressed white around the sack in her arms. She knew if she said one word, just one, they'd take it as permission to tear into her with teeth bared and tongues sharper than knives. "Wasn't she the one that got caught with the stable hand?" one of the boys asked, pretending to whisper, but loud enough the street dogs heard it. "No, no," Maybelle said. "That was last year. This one got herself tangled up with a travelling preacher. Or was it the school teacher? Hard to keep track." Another round of laughter. She could have told them the truth. How she'd said no. How she'd screamed. How she'd been 16 and afraid and nobody came. But truth didn't matter in this town. What mattered was shame. And once they decided, you wore it. Nothing you did could wash it off. June stepped away from the wall, her heart pounding so loud it drowned out their jeers. She walked, not fast enough to look afraid, not slow enough to seem unaffected. Just steady. Just enough to get herself gone before the tears rose. But then, over the laughter and whispers, came a voice like gravel and river rock, quiet, deep and flat as the prairie horizon. Leave her. Everything stopped. Not in the way where someone yells and people flinch, but in the way lightning pauses before it strikes. June turned. The man was tall, lean in a way that said he didn't waste strength on things that didn't matter. His boots were old. His hat had been through rain, sun, and war by the looks of it. And his eyes didn't even look at the others, just at her. Maybelle blinked. "Excuse me," she said, all sugar gone from her voice. The man stepped forward. "I said leave her. You don't know what you're talking about, and you're too loud to be this wrong." Nobody spoke. The man turned to June. "You all right, miss?" She stared, nodded. "Just once." He nodded back. "Then let's go." She followed without thinking. The sack of flour clutched like a lifeline. They walked past the mercantile, past the well, past the little boy with a slingshot, watching from behind a barrel. They didn't stop till they were clear of town, where the trees started to thicken and the sky didn't feel so close. Only then did June look back. "Why'd you do that?" she asked, voice hoarse. He didn't look at her, didn't like the way they smelled. Smelled? Like rot, envy. Rotten things make a certain stink. She laughed once, too sharp. To sound like real laughter. "You don't even know me." "Don't have to. Saw enough." He turned finally, Name's Silas Wade. I've got a place out north of here. Quiet, clean water, sky you can breathe under. Could use someone who knows how to sew. Chicken's been looking ragged. June stared at him. Are you asking me to come live with you? I'm asking you to consider it. I won't touch you. I won't hurt you. I won't let anyone else do either. Why? Silas shrugged. 'Cause I was raised better. The sun was starting to drop low. June felt the weight of the sack in her arms, the ache in her feet, and the sting of every word she hadn't said. She could turn around. Go back to her little rented room above the smithy. Back to stares, whispers, the cold judgment of women who prayed harder than they listened. Or she could follow the man who hadn't blinked at her name and didn't seem to need to. She took a step forward. Silas didn't smile, but he nodded like he'd been expecting it all along. By the time the town realized she was gone, June was already asleep in a bed softer than she'd known in years. Her door bolted from the inside, her sack of flour tucked in a corner like a silly, stubborn memory of where she came from. But peace never lasted long in these parts. Not for girls, with pasts like hers. Not when tongues liked to wag, and men didn't like the idea of a woman they couldn't shame staying safe. And somewhere out there, someone had just found out where she was. Someone with the same last name as her. Someone who'd taken more than he'd ever been punished for. The hens didn't care about the past. They squawked and pecked and fluffed themselves at the hem of June's skirt, like she'd been feeding them for years instead of just 3 days. Their warmth, their noise, even the dusty smell of the coop. It all helped quiet the storm in her chest, the one that still twisted up when she thought about the look on Maybelle Cartwright's face, or the way Dora had crossed the street to avoid her last summer like shame could spread through the air. But chickens didn't care about scandal. Chickens cared about grain, and she could give them that. Behind her, the sound of a pail being set down told her Silas was back. He didn't say anything. He rarely did. Just moved beside her, knees creaking, as he squatted and ran one slow hand along the rough edge of the coop's feed bin. She glanced at him out of the corner of her eye. His sleeves were rolled to the elbows again, forearms sun-browned and marked with a jagged scar across one wrist, like a rope had once tried to keep him. He worked like someone who didn't mind pain, but didn't invite it either. "Storm comin'," he said. She looked up. Sky was still blue, still clear. "Doesn't look it." "Not the sky I'm talking about." Her chest went tight. "Someone said something." Silas's jaw twitched. "Saw your uncle in town, talking loud, face like he's looking for a fight he already lost. He's stirring things up." She swallowed. Her uncle, Pastor Abraham Grant. Her mother's brother, keeper of the church and every unspoken rule in town. He was the one who'd taken her in when her mother died and her father vanished. He was the one who'd locked the doors when she came home crying, who'd told her no man would ever marry a girl who let herself be used. The one who told the whole town what had happened, and just enough lies to make it her fault. "He knows where I am?" she asked, throat dry. "Not yet, but he's trying." June turned back to the coop, trying to keep her breath steady. "He'll come. You know that, right?" Silas didn't answer at first. Then, "Let him." Something in the way he said it made her shiver, though it wasn't a threat. Just calm. Like he'd already faced worse and come through it on the other side. But the thought of Abraham Grant on this land, on Silas's land, sent June's mind spinning. The man held power, not just fists or guns, but the kind of quiet power born from sermons and secrets. He knew how to use both. They worked in silence for a while, finishing up the feeding, fixing a splintered board along the coop's back wall. The sun dropped lower, gold creeping along the hills like honey poured from a jar. When they stepped into the house, the scent of stew filled the air. Rabbit and beans, something Silas had shot the day before. He ate slow, quiet as always, while June sat across from him, chewing each bite like it might be her last. She'd lived in silence before, but not like this. Not comfortable, companionable silence. Back in town, silence had meant punishment. Now it meant peace. But peace didn't come easy to women like her, and it didn't stick around for long. Later that night, she heard it, the crunch of gravel outside. Just one footstep, then another. Not enough for a group, just one man. June froze, hand clenched around the edge of her blanket, eyes straining in the dark. Silas didn't move. She couldn't even tell if he was awake. Then came the knock. 3 slow raps. Not hard, not urgent, but wrong. Nobody knocked this far out unless they meant to stir something up. June's body went cold. Silas rose, smooth and silent, like a shadow pulled up from the floor. He didn't light a lamp, just moved to the door, cracked it. June couldn't hear what was said at first, only the murmur of voices, one low and steady, the other slurred and sharp. Then, "She's here. I know she is." It was her uncle. June's breath hitched. "I ain't got time to humor you, Pastor," Silas said flatly. "Get off my land. I raised her. I've a right to speak to her. You raised her like a man raises cattle for slaughter. You want to talk, you go back and write a letter." June crept closer to the wall, heart hammering. "I'll be back with a deputy," her uncle growled. "You bring one," Silas said, voice like iron. "But you bring a coroner too. One of you ain't leaving." The door shut. Silas stood there for a long moment. June could barely breathe. When he finally turned, he looked at her, eyes soft in a way she hadn't expected. "Go back to sleep," he said. She didn't. The next day passed with tension thick in the air. Silas didn't say much, but he checked the gate 3 times, walked the perimeter of his property twice, and cleaned his rifle like it was a sermon he meant to preach. June watched him from the porch, hands clenched in her lap. She knew this would get worse before it got better. By midday, it did. The deputy arrived with Abraham. He rode in flanked by 2 men, one with a badge, the other with eyes too eager. Abraham stood behind them like he was overseeing a crusade. June stood behind Silas on the porch, her shoulders squared, even though her knees shook. "We've come for the girl," the deputy said. "She's not a girl. She's a woman," Silas replied. "And she's not yours to come for." "She's a moral threat to the town," Abraham said. "Living in sin, flaunting it. She's not married. She's not yours to judge. She is, if she wants, to live within a day's ride of my church." Silas stepped forward, down the steps. "She lives here now, under my roof, and if you say one more word about her purity, I'll teach you what filth really looks like." The deputy shifted. "You threatening us?" "No," Silas said. "I'm making it clear. She's under my protection." Abraham's face turned red. "You're a fool if you think she's worth it. She's broken." Silas didn't blink. "Then I suppose I'm the kind of fool who marries broken things. Good thing I brought this." From his pocket he pulled a small silver ring. Simple, worn, but real. He turned, looked June square in the eyes. "I won't ask you unless you want it," he said. "But if you say yes, there's not a man alive who can take you from me." June couldn't speak. The men stared. Abraham scoffed. She wouldn't, but she did. Her voice came out quiet. "Yes." And just like that, the world changed, Abraham shouted. The deputy hesitated. Silas stepped back beside her, his presence solid as a wall. They stood together on the porch as the men rode off, dust rising behind them like the last flare of a dying fire. Later, when the stars were out and the land was quiet again, June sat beside Silas near the fire. The ring sat on her finger, like it belonged there. "You really mean to keep me?" she asked softly. "I don't keep people," he said. "I stand beside 'em. That's what you do when someone's been burned by every hand they trusted." She looked down. "I don't know how to be a wife." "You'll figure it out. I'll be here." The peace in that moment was fragile, but real. And it held. For now. But peace, like glass, could be shattered by one wrong step. and in the shadows, beyond their land, someone had already begun walking toward them. The marriage wasn't formalized by church bells or a procession. There was no preacher, no binding paper, no crowd to witness the moment. It happened the way most true things did in the West, quietly, under the open sky, with only the wind and the stars for witnesses. Silas carved a band from bone the next day and set it beside her plate at breakfast. When June looked up, he nodded once, and that was that. She wore the ring, and she stayed. But peace, however soft and hard-earned, had a way of drawing envy. And envy had a sharp mouth. By the end of the week, riders started circling the far edge of Silas's property. Not close enough to be trespassing, just close enough to remind her she was being watched. They weren't lawmen. These were ranch hands from town, boys with idle hands and mean streaks sharpened by their father's failures. Some of them had laughed at her before. Some had called her names in the street. One of them, Caleb Merton, had once shoved her down outside the mercantile and called her soiled. Now they waited on the edge of Silas's land, sneering from their saddles like wolves watching a barn cat that didn't know it was dinner. June didn't tell Silas at first. She didn't want him going after them. She knew what would happen if he did. But he found out anyway. He came in one evening, jaw tight, blood on his knuckles. "I handled it," he said. "What does that mean?" June asked, setting down the bowl she was drying. Silas poured water into a basin, started washing his hands. "Means they'll think twice before riding that close again." She stepped closer. "I don't need you fighting my battles." He didn't look up. "I know, but I'm not standing back while you get hunted by the same people who called you unclean for surviving." June crossed her arms. "I wasn't hunted. I was—" She stopped herself, the words too tangled to finish. "I didn't do anything wrong. I know that. Then why do I still feel like I did?" Silas's voice softened. "Because when a whole town treats you like dirt, it's hard not to believe you are." The silence stretched. Then he added, "But you're not." Later that night, she found the blood-stained rag he'd tossed outside. It wasn't just a fight. Someone had hit him with something sharp. She saw the slice through his shirt where the fabric still held a bit of blood, and she knew then this wasn't over. It had only just begun. The storm broke a week later. June was down by the creek, collecting water. She liked the hush there, the hush and the hummingbirds, and how the rush of the water reminded her there were still things in this world that didn't care about gossip or shame. She filled the pail halfway when a voice broke through the trees behind her. "Well, ain't you a picture?" She froze. Caleb Merton. He stood 5 yards behind her, gun on his hip, smirk on his face. 2 others stood behind him, boys from town. One had a toothpick clenched between his teeth. The other looked barely old enough to shave. All 3 carried the smell of sweat and whiskey. June straightened slowly. "You're not supposed to be here." "You think that line means something?" Caleb asked, stepping closer. "You think just 'cause you put on a ring and played house with the quiet man, folks are gonna forget what you are?" "I think it's none of your business what I am," she said, voice steadier than she felt. "That, so?" He looked her up and down, lips curling. "You think he knows what he married? You think he knows how many of us could have had a turn if we'd just waited long enough?" June's hand tightened on the pail's handle. Her breath stilled. "I said leave," she hissed. Caleb stepped closer. "Or what? You'll cry like last time? And then I'll break your jaw." The voice came from behind them. Calm. Quiet. "Silas." Caleb turned, startled, just in time to catch the butt of Silas's rifle square against his temple. He dropped like a stone. The other 2 scrambled. One tried to draw. Silas cocked his rifle and leveled it, eyes hard and dark. "You want to be next?" They didn't. They ran, tripping over roots and each other. June stood frozen as Silas came to her, lifted the pail from her hand like it weighed nothing. "You all right?" he asked. She nodded, but she wasn't. Not really. The town sheriff came the next morning. He didn't come alone. Half the town had followed him, like buzzards to a carcass. June watched them from the window, Dora and Maybelle, and two of the old churchwomen who always sat in the front pews and whispered behind handkerchiefs. Even some men she'd once called uncles by marriage. Now they looked at her like she was vermin. The sheriff didn't bother with greetings. "You assaulted a man," he told Silas. "He trespassed, threatened my wife. She's not your wife. In the eyes of the law. She's mine in the eyes of anyone who knows what it means to stand beside someone," Silas replied. The sheriff's lip curled. "The boy's got a broken jaw. Then he'll learn to keep it shut." The crowd tittered. Someone spit. Someone called her a harlot. Then the sheriff said, "You'll come into town. Answer for what you did." "I will not," Silas said. "And if you think you can take me, you best bring more men and less mouths." It could have ended there. It didn't. A rock flew through the window, smashed the pane beside June's head. Another followed. Then shouting, "She poisoned our daughters. She corrupted the town. She don't belong here." June ducked, hands over her head. Silas grabbed her, pulled her behind him, shielded her as more glass shattered. The sheriff tried to speak, tried to call for calm, but he was drowned out by the sound of old rage rising. Someone set the barn on fire. Flames licked skyward before anyone could stop them. Silas stepped onto the porch, rifle raised. "Get off! My land!" he roared. The crowd froze. Then, from behind them, a new voice rose. "Let the girl speak." It was Miss Edna Thorne. 75 if a day, stooped with age, but sharp-eyed. She'd run the post office for 20 years and seen every scandal the town had to offer. She stood now with her chin high and her cane firm in the dirt. "If the girl's done wrong, let her say so," Edna said. "Otherwise, let the menfolk. Stop acting like dogs who lost their bone." All eyes turned to June. She stepped forward, heart pounding, skin stinging from the heat of the barn. The smoke curled behind her like a halo. "I never lied," she said, voice shaking. "I never took anything that wasn't forced on me. You want to blame someone. Blame the men who cornered me after church. Blame the fathers who let their sons run wild and then told me it was my fault. Blame the preacher who turned me out for not bleeding enough to be holy." The silence after her words was thick. Then she added, "But I won't apologize for surviving." She turned to Silas. He nodded, once. Together, they stepped down the porch steps, walked past the sheriff, past the gawking crowd, toward the burning barn. They didn't look back. Not even when someone wept. Not even when Maybelle dropped her handkerchief and covered her face like June's words had finally reached somewhere soft. But not all hearts turned that day. And one man, Abraham Grant, watched from the hilltop, eyes narrowed. He had power still. And he wasn't done with her. Not yet. The fire burned for hours. Silas tried to save what he could. But the barn was old, the walls dry, the hay stacked high. By the time the flames gave way to ash and the sky turned pale with dawn, there was nothing left but the black skeleton of what had stood. June hadn't spoken much. She'd stood barefoot in the field, watching it burn down to cinders. The heat had blistered her cheek, but she hadn't moved. Not even when Silas reached for her hand. That morning, Silas dug out the old rifle he'd kept hidden beneath the floorboards. June had never seen it before. It was heavier than the one he carried on his back, a long gun, etched with markings she didn't recognize, and polished as if waiting for a war that hadn't come yet. He didn't explain where it came from. He only loaded it, piece by piece, with a silence that hummed like a wire pulled taut. "We'll rebuild," June said. Silas nodded once. "We will." But they both knew rebuilding wouldn't be enough. Not now. The barn fire had changed everything. The next few days passed like a held breath. June didn't go into town. She didn't send letters. She didn't walk the creek trail. The silence out there, once her refuge, now felt watched. She felt eyes where there were none, weight in the air like a coming storm. The land held its hush too long, and in the distance June could hear the warning creak of something coming undone. Then, on the fourth night, a rider came. She heard the hoofbeats first, late, long past midnight. Silas was already sitting by the door, the long gun across his knees. June stood behind him, barefoot again, the hem of her nightgown soaked from where she'd been pacing. The rider didn't approach the house. He stopped at the fence line, raised one hand, and dropped something into the dirt before galloping off. In the morning they found a cloth bundle. Inside it, a single white ribbon. June recognized it at once. It had once belonged to her sister, her older sister, Ruth. Ruth had vanished 3 years back. Gone north, they'd said. Married a merchant. Sent a letter once and never again. June had always wondered. The ribbon had been hers. June had helped tie it in her braid the day she left. Now it was blood-stained. June dropped to her knees in the grass. Her stomach turned cold. "She's alive," she whispered. Or she was. Silas squatted beside her, examining the bundle. Inside the folds of the cloth, there was a note scrawled in crooked, hurried ink. "You think you get to be clean again? You forgot what you come from." So we brought it back. The signature was a single letter, a Abraham Grant. The name hadn't been said out loud in their home, but June knew it the way she knew the shape of a bruise. Abraham had once been the town's most respected man, a rancher, a deacon, a pillar. He'd also been the one to speak out first against her, to call her impure, to say what happened to her was proof of wickedness. What people didn't know, what she had never told anyone, not even Silas, was that Abraham had offered to cleanse her. That night, long ago, when her shame was still raw and no one would speak her name, Abraham had cornered her behind the chapel and whispered promises. He'd said purity could be restored. He'd said he'd help her forget. But the way he'd touched her shoulder, the way he'd looked at her lips, it hadn't been holy. It had been something darker. She had run, and now he was back. That afternoon, they saddled the horses. "Where are we going?" she asked. Silas handed her the old revolver he rarely used. "To find your sister." They rode out before dusk, following no road. The message had come from the South Ridge, and Silas knew enough about Abraham to guess where he might be holed. Up. There was a mining cabin, abandoned since the silver ran dry, that sat near the edge of the salt flats, hidden in a cleft of rock and shadow. If anyone wanted to stash a woman without being found, that's where they'd go. They reached it by midnight. The cabin stood silent, the windows dark. One horse was tied to a post out front. No fire smoke curled from the chimney, but June felt it, the presence inside, the ache of something wrong. Silas dismounted first, rifle drawn. June followed, her fingers white around the revolver's grip. They stepped onto the porch. The door creaked open, and Ruth stepped out. Only, it wasn't Ruth as June remembered her. Her hair was shorn, ragged, her cheeks hollow, one eye swollen shut. But her posture, even in pain, held dignity. She looked at June, and her lips parted, trembled. "June," she whispered. June dropped the revolver. "Ruth." They met in the middle of the porch, arms crashing around each other. Ruth's body shook with sobs, her breath rattling against June's shoulder. "I didn't run," Ruth said. "They took me." "Who?" June asked, though she already knew. "Abraham and others. They said I'd brought shame. They wanted to fix me." Silas kept watch, scanning the darkness. "We can't stay. If they brought her here, they'll come back." Ruth pulled back, blinking. "There's more. He's got others. Girls. In the canyon." Silas froze. "How many?" 3, maybe 4. "I only saw them once. He keeps them hidden. Says he's building a haven. A place to restore what's been lost." June's blood ran cold. That night they didn't sleep. Ruth stayed wrapped in blankets beside the fire while June and Silas planned. They couldn't go to the sheriff. Not now. Not without proof. And the town had already made its stance clear. Righteous men like Abraham didn't face punishment. Not unless the evidence was undeniable. So Silas decided to make it undeniable. They rode at dawn. Ruth stayed behind. June didn't want to leave her, but Ruth's ribs were bruised, her legs swollen. She couldn't ride. The canyon was 10 miles out. Rugged terrain, red rock, gullies deep enough to bury secrets. Silas led the way. June followed, her revolver tucked tight against her leg. The sun rose slowly, turning the cliffs to flame. By the time they reached the canyon mouth, they could already see smoke. Someone was there. They tethered the horses and crept forward on foot, moving low between rocks. The smoke came from a cook fire near the base of a ledge. 2 men stood nearby, rifles slung carelessly. A canvas tent was pitched against the cliff wall, and outside that tent, girls, young, dirty, silent. One held a doll with no head, another rocked slowly back and forth. June's stomach twisted. One of the men laughed. Then another figure stepped out of the tent. Abraham. His beard was grayer, but the cruelty in his eyes hadn't faded. He said something too quiet to hear. One of the girls flinched. He raised his hand, slapped her hard. June stepped forward, fury burning. Silas grabbed her arm. "Not yet," he whispered. "We wait." But June didn't wait. She moved before he could stop her. Up the ridge, around behind, the ledge. By the time she reached the top, she had the high ground and a clear shot. "Hey, preacher man!" she shouted. Abraham turned, squinting. June raised the revolver. "This one's for Ruth." She fired. The shot missed. On purpose. She wanted him, alive, wanted him to feel it. The camp erupted. Silas moved fast, swinging down from the ridge with his rifle. One of the men tried to draw. Silas shot first, clean through the shoulder. Abraham ran. June chased. He scrambled down the canyon path, stumbling. She followed, breath ragged. At the canyon's edge, he turned. "You think this changes anything?" he spat. "You think they'll believe a girl like you over a man like me?" "I don't care if they believe me," she said. "I'm not afraid of you. You should be." He reached for his belt, knife flashing. But before he could lunge, Silas tackled him from the side, slamming him into the dirt. The knife skidded away. June stood over him, revolver aimed. "I should kill you," she said. Abraham's mouth bled. "But I won't," she whispered, "because I want you to live long enough to see everything burn." And with that, she turned away. Silas tied Abraham's hands, gagged him, dragged him back to camp. They gathered the girls, and together they rode, back toward town, toward justice, toward fire. Because June wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. By the time they reached the outskirts of town, June was no longer the same woman who had once kept her head down in the bakery, who had flinched when whispers followed her into the dry goods store. She rode at the front now, revolver holstered, openly at her hip, shoulders squared, wind tangling her hair. Behind her came Silas, silent as always, and trailing them both was the wagon, creaking, slow-moving, burdened not just with Abraham Grant, bound and unconscious, but with 4 frightened girls who barely spoke above a whisper. One of them had never spoken at all. They entered just past midday. The sun hung high and the streets buzzed with routine. Mothers folding laundry over porches, boys kicking dust down alleyways, the blacksmith hammering away without looking up. But when the townsfolk saw the wagon and recognized the man slumped over in ropes, when they saw June, with ash still streaked across her cheek from the fire, and her eyes burning hotter than a forge, everything stopped. Whispers rose first. Then gasps, then silence. It was Mrs. Mercer, the sheriff's wife, who stepped forward first. Her apron was still dusted in flour, and her gaze skipped from June to the bound man. "Is that—" she started. "Yes," June said. It's Abraham. Behind her, the smallest girl on the wagon whimpered. The sound cracked through the square like a gunshot. June dismounted. She didn't wait for questions. She climbed onto the wagon bed, gently helped each of the girls down, one by one, and guided them toward the chapel steps. Then she turned. I want the sheriff. There was hesitation. The townsfolk shifted, glancing toward each other, uncertain whether to believe their eyes or ears, until Silas stepped down and said, "Now." That broke it. Sheriff Aiken emerged from the saloon, still drying his hands, on a bar rag. He was a good man in the way people claim to be, neither cruel nor brave, and most days just tired. But when he saw who lay in the wagon, his face paled a full shade. "June," he said carefully, "what's going on?" "You tell me," she snapped. "This is your town, your deacon, your holy man." She told the story in the middle of the square. No exaggeration, no theatrics. Just truth, laid bare under the sun. She told them about Ruth, about the canyon, about the girls with rope burns on their wrists and bruises on their hips. She told them what Abraham said, that they weren't pure, and he was their salvation. She let them see her fury, yes, but more than that, her grief, the years she'd carried shame that was never hers. And when she was done, there wasn't a man, woman, or child in that crowd who could look her in the eyes. The sheriff scratched his jaw. "This is a lot. You think I'm lying?" "No." "Then, what are you waiting for?" He looked at the girls again, then at Abraham's body. "We'll lock him up until the circuit judge rides through." June nodded once. "You'll need more than a cell. He's not done lying yet." They hauled Abraham off to the jailhouse, and for the first time in a very long time, June slept. The trial was set for 2 weeks later. The girls stayed at the chapel under Mrs. Mercer's watch, and Ruth, though weak, testified first. Her voice cracked when she said Abraham's name, but her spine stayed straight. The people in the pews wept as she spoke, some with guilt, others with rage, most with shame. Abraham, from his cell, denied everything, claimed the girls were troubled, said he'd been running a home for the fallen, said June was still angry that he'd tried to guide her and she'd refused, said she was jealous, hateful, dirty. "He's going to twist it," Silas warned her. He already did. They didn't expect the trial to go fairly. What they didn't expect was for the Reverend to testify. Reverend Talbot stood slowly when called, trembling with his hands clasped tight. "I should have spoken years ago," he said. "I saw things. I heard things. But I told myself it wasn't my place." His eyes moved to June, then back to the crowd. "It was always my place." He recounted a letter he'd found hidden in Abraham's desk, written in Ruth's handwriting, begging for release. He'd burned it, he said, out of fear, of scandal, of upsetting the flock. His confession shattered the courtroom. By the third day of testimony, there was no one left defending Abraham. But the judge still hesitated. The law in those parts was fickle, and men like Abraham knew how to twist it like rope. So June made a decision. She rose from her seat and walked to the stand. The room hushed. "I have something else," she said. The judge raised a brow. "You're not on the witness list." "I am now." She opened her palm, and in it, the ribbon, Ruth's ribbon, stained with blood. "I wore this the day I lost everything," June said. "And again the day I took it back." Her voice cracked, but only once. Abraham Grant used his power to hurt people, not just me, not just Ruth, children. He did it while calling himself a man of God, and every person who looked the other way made him bolder. She glanced at the crowd. "So here we are. I'm not asking for justice. I'm demanding it." The judge didn't speak, not at first. Then slowly, he nodded. When the gavel came down, it echoed louder than thunder. Abraham Grant was sentenced to hang. But justice is never simple. 2 days before the execution, the jailhouse burned. They found the deputy tied. Up in the feed room, Abraham was gone. Someone helped him, the sheriff said, spitting into the dirt. Had to. June didn't speak. Silas paced the porch for hours. When the sun set, the riders came. 4 of them, faces hidden, rifles in hand. June stood in the doorway, revolver ready. "We're here for the girl," one of them said. Silas stepped beside her. "You're not getting her." They laughed. "You think she gets to live free after what she's done to men like us?" June's heart thundered. She wasn't just fighting Abraham anymore. She was fighting every man who thought her voice was too loud, her truth too inconvenient. Every man who'd called her unclean, unfit, unwanted. "Leave now," she said, "or don't leave at all." The riders exchanged glances. The one in front, tall, with a scar down his jaw, raised his rifle. That's when the shot rang out. But it didn't come from the porch. It came from behind the barn. A 5th rider. Ruth. She'd taken Silas's long rifle and fired it from behind the rain barrel. The shot caught the man in the arm. He dropped his rifle and fell off his horse. The others scattered. By the time the dust cleared, 2 were gone. 1 remained, kneeling with hands up. "We didn't think she'd fight," he said. "We thought she'd run." "She's done running," Silas said. That night the town came together again. This time, not in a courtroom, but under the stars. They rebuilt the barn, repaired the porch. Silas never said much, but he stood beside June as they worked, shoulder to shoulder, quiet and steady. And when the sun rose the next morning, June stood at the top of the hill overlooking the valley, Ruth beside her. "You ever think we'd get here?" Ruth asked. "No," June said honestly, "but I'm glad we did. There was still healing to be done, scars to carry, stories to tell, but something had shifted, and as the wind rose and carried away the dust, June felt something she hadn't known in years. Hope. But that feeling didn't last long, because just before nightfall, Silas rode back from the trading post with news. A new bounty had been posted in the next town over. A bounty on June. "Dead or alive," he said, eyes grim, and the name signed at the bottom, A.G. Abraham Grant, was still out there, and he wanted vengeance. They read the bounty twice. The ink was still wet when Silas brought it in from the post, a folded paper, creased and smudged from the ride, but unmistakable in its message. June Wallace. Dead or alive. $2,000 reward. At the bottom, not even a full name, just an elegant scrawl, cruel in its confidence. A.G. Ruth's hand flew to her mouth. The others barely breathed. Silas stood stone still at the hearth, his jaw tight and unreadable. June stared at the page as if it might vanish if she looked hard enough. But it didn't. It sat there, bold and deliberate, and beneath the fear pulsing at the base of her throat came something colder, stronger, fury. 2,000, she whispered. "That's how much I'm worth to him." Silas crossed to her. "It's not what you're worth. It's what he's afraid of. He wants me dead. He knows you've won. That bounty is a bluff. He's desperate." June shook her head. A desperate man with nothing to lose is still dangerous. Maybe more so. Ruth hadn't moved. She was staring at the folded edges of the paper, her voice small. "People will come, won't they?" June nodded. "They already are." And indeed, that same afternoon, they saw the first one. He rode in slow, deliberate, pausing to water his horse at the trough near the mercantile. His boots were dustless, his coat too clean for any real work. His eyes, black and blank, never moved off June when she passed with Silas. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. She knew. A second came 2 days later. Then a third. One tried to ask Ruth where June might be hiding. She spat at his feet and slammed the chapel door. They didn't wear badges. They didn't call themselves bounty hunters. But they didn't have to. They travelled light, asked little, and left people nervous in their own homes. Some of them just watched from porches. Some followed her when she walked. None made their move. Not yet. But something in town had shifted. People stopped opening their doors. Mothers kept children inside. Shopkeepers passed goods through cracks in shutters. The silence grew thick, heavier than summer heat. Sheriff Aiken did what he could, but he was one man with one deputy and a jail half burned through. He gave June a worn shotgun and asked her if she could shoot. "I learned," she said, "when they made sure I'd have to." The bounty hunters didn't come in the night, as expected. They came at dawn, when mist still laced the streets and most were sleeping through the dust-choked heat. The first broke into the chapel. June was already there, sleeping on a cot in the back with one hand on her revolver. She heard the creak of the door, the shuffle of boots on wood. No one else would be entering at this hour. She didn't hesitate. The first shot cracked and echoed through the pews. He screamed. His leg hit clean through. Ruth screamed from the stairwell. June rose, fast and cold, and didn't aim to kill, only to stop him. "You're not dying in this church," she told him as he writhed. "But you're not walking out either." By the time the sheriff arrived, she'd already tied a tourniquet and dragged the man into the square, and she left him there as a warning. But warnings have limits, especially when money's involved. That same afternoon, 3 more came, together this time. Ruth saw them first from the bell tower. She rang it once, then again, and June bolted from the back of the bakery where she'd been collecting bread for the girls. Silas met her at the edge of the alley. "They're not subtle." "No," June said, loading her revolver. "They don't need to be." The men didn't wait. They spread out across the square, rifles raised like they were back in wartime. They didn't call her name, didn't issue demands. They simply started moving toward the chapel. Ruth and the girls were still inside. June fired first. The crack ricocheted off the cobblestones. One man ducked, another spun and ran, caught off guard by her speed. The third fired wildly, catching a shutter and sending splinters through the air. It was chaos, swift and clumsy. Silas flanked the far side, circling the saloon, waiting for the right angle. June ducked behind the trough, heart pounding. This wasn't justice anymore. This was survival. She took one more shot, clean through the rifle stock of the man closing in. He dropped his weapon. Silas disarmed the second with a single tackle, pressing his knee into the man's chest until the breath wheezed out of him. But the third was gone. Vanished into the alleyways, silent as smoke. Silas stood, breathing hard. "They're testing us." June stared down at the man beneath him. "They're waiting for the one who'll finish what they start." The town couldn't take much more. At night, people blocked their doors. By day, they avoided June in the streets, not out of hate, but out of fear. Her presence invited danger. Her past had become their threat. Even Ruth began to fray at the edges. She couldn't sleep, kept watching the doors, jumped at the sound of boots. The other girls, too, began to tremble even in the sun, huddling, together in corners, flinching at every knock. One morning, Ruth pulled June aside. Her voice cracked. "Maybe you should leave." June stared at her. "Leave? Just until they forget. Until he stops." "He won't stop, Ruth." "I know, but the others, these girls, they didn't ask for this. They don't have anyone else." June closed her eyes. She knew Ruth wasn't wrong, but it still cut. She'd tried to save them, protect them. Now her very presence threatened their peace. Silas found her that night sitting outside the jailhouse, with her revolver in her lap. "Thinking of running?" he asked quietly. "I'm thinking I brought a storm to a town that didn't ask for rain." He didn't speak for a while. Then, "You brought truth. That's never easy. Truth doesn't keep people safe." "No, but it gives them a chance." She looked up at him. "I don't know if I have any more fight in me." "You do," he said. "Because if you didn't, you'd be gone already." The next day, the man arrived. He wore no hat, no spurs, no badge. just a long brown coat and a scar across the left side of his chin. He didn't smile, didn't speak. He walked straight into the center of town, past the mercantile, past the saloon, past the chapel. He left his horse untied at the trough. Then he stopped in front of the sheriff's office, and he waited. It wasn't until Silas spotted the silver badge hidden under the man's coat that everything changed. "He's not a bounty hunter," Silas said. "He's a killer." "What?" "He's a cleaner. Someone men like Abraham send when everything else fails. He doesn't ask. He doesn't take prisoners." June stared out the window. The man still hadn't moved. And then, in the quiet of the afternoon, he reached into his coat. June grabbed her revolver. "This is it." But he didn't draw a gun. He pulled out a match, and with deliberate slowness, he lit it, just once, then dropped it to the dirt. It was a signal. The last signal. The real attack would come at night. They barricaded the chapel. Silas moved the girls into the cellar. June took the rooftop. Ruth insisted on staying above ground, armed with her late father's hunting rifle. The town was quiet again. Too quiet. Then the smoke began. Not from the jailhouse, from the bakery. They were setting fires, using the chaos as cover. Flames climbed fast and wild, licking the windows, cracking the night open with heat and screams. June saw movement. 5 men this time, not 3. Moving in from all sides. It wasn't about the bounty anymore. It was about silencing her. She fired twice. 1 man went down. The others scattered. Silas flanked the north side. Ruth took down another from the window, crying out as glass shattered beside her head. The heat from the bakery fire lit the whole square, and in the middle of it stood the man in the brown coat. Watching, waiting. June didn't wait. She charged, through smoke and ash, through screams and gunfire. She didn't care if she made it. She just knew she had to try. She tackled him into the dirt, knees first, knocking the breath from both of them. He drew a knife, not a gun, and slashed once, grazing her arm. She headbutted him, grabbed his wrist, slammed it into the stones. The knife fell. He grabbed her throat. She kicked his knee sideways with everything she had. He screamed. She shoved her forearm into his jaw, pressing until her knuckles ached. And finally, he slumped. She stood, bloodied and shaking. It was over. But then, a single sound broke through the smoke. A child's scream from inside the chapel. One of the girls hadn't made it to the cellar, and someone else had. The scream rang out sharp and high, slicing through the smoke and heat like a blade. June's blood turned to ice. She didn't even pause to breathe. She just ran. Her boots pounded over ash-coated ground, through fire-sparked haze, up the chapel steps. The doors had been broken open, one hanging crooked off its hinge. Inside, the pews were shattered. Glass crackled beneath her feet, and the smell of gunpowder mixed with scorched wood. Another scream, this one muffled, but closer. June vaulted over the altar rail, bolted into the hallway behind the pulpit. That's when she saw the shape, a figure crouched near the choir room door, dragging someone by the wrist. Let her go. June's voice ripped through the corridor like a whip. The man turned. He wasn't one of the ones from earlier. This one was smaller, faster. His face covered by a handkerchief, eyes wild with desperation. The girl he had, Elsie, couldn't have been more than 6. Her dress was torn, cheek bloodied. She kicked and clawed, but he dragged her like a sack of grain, gun in his other hand. "I'll kill her," he snarled. June raised her weapon. "No, you won't. You think I won't." He pressed the barrel to Elsie's temple. She sobbed. "Back off!" June didn't move. Her hand was steady. Her voice came calm and flat. "You're not walking out of here alive either way. Might as well not take a child with you. I'll shoot. You won't. Because you don't want to die with that kind of stain on your soul." "I already got a stain." His voice cracked. Already done worse. June stared at him, really saw him. Not a killer, a coward. Probably promised easy money for a quick snatch. Didn't count on resistance. Didn't count on fire or bullets or a town full of people who'd already bled too much. You're scared, she said, stepping closer. Stay back. But his hand was trembling now. She's 6. You let her go and I won't kill you. He blinked. His lip twitched. Then, so fast it barely registered, he shoved Elsie forward and ran. June caught the girl with one arm, spun her to safety, and fired. The bullet tore through his thigh. He screamed and went down hard, slamming into the wall with a grunt. Elsie sobbed in her arms, trembling like a leaf. It's okay, June whispered, pressing her forehead to the child's. I've got you. You're safe now. I promise. And she meant it. With every shredded, beaten part of her. She meant it. The rest of the night passed in fragments. The fire took the bakery and half the mercantile. Sheriff Aiken caught a bullet to the shoulder. Silas's hand was split open by a blade, but he stayed standing, guarding the girls with his back to the door. Ruth fainted from smoke inhalation, but woke up swinging at a man who tried to get past her into the chapel. They fought like cornered animals and saints alike. By dawn, 6 of the attackers were dead, 2 captured, the rest gone into the hills. The man in the brown coat never woke up. And the town? It survived. Barely. But it survived. June stood in the square, blackened with soot, her dress torn, her knuckles bleeding. Around her, the sun rose on a different place. Not safer, not healed, but stronger. Ruth came to her, leaning heavily on a crutch. She'd torn something in her leg during the fight. June looked at her. I'm sorry. For what? I brought this on you. On them. No, Ruth said, fierce despite the bandages. He did. You brought the end of it. Behind them, the girls trickled out of the chapel, one by one, some crying, some holding hands. One of them, little Elsie, ran forward and wrapped her arms around June's waist. Don't leave, the child whispered. Please don't leave. June's throat tightened. I'm not. You promise? I promise. It took days to bury the dead, weeks to clear the rubble, a month before the chapel could reopen. But through it all, June stayed. She helped. Rebuild the bakery. She taught the girls how to shoot, not because she wanted them armed, but because she wanted them strong. She cooked alongside Ruth, cleaned bandages, held small hands during nightmares. She became, without quite meaning to, the center of something. The town never called her a whore again. They called her Miss Wallace, or sometimes just Ma'am. She didn't laugh when they did. She nodded once, humbly, and went back to work. Silas stayed too, quiet as always, a constant presence beside her. They didn't speak much at first, but one morning, as they were fixing the barn roof near the orphanage, he passed her a hammer and said, You think you might marry me someday? She nearly dropped it. He didn't smile. He didn't laugh. Just looked at her, steady and sure. She blinked at him. Why? Because I don't want to spend the rest of my life beside you just hammering roofs. I want it to mean something. June looked down at the hammer in her hand, then at the crooked plank between them. Then she looked up. Ask me again when the town is whole. All right, he said, but I'll keep asking until you say yes. They rebuilt slow, but strong. One girl at a time, June watched them grow, braver, wilder, kinder. She started a school at the edge of town, not just for orphans, for anyone, poor farmhands, street, kids, girls no one would take. She didn't ask about their pasts, just gave them a seat, a pencil, and a promise. You're not ruined, she told them. You're ready. The bounty was never reissued. Rumour said Abraham Garrett had left the territory. Some whispered he'd been found in a river up north. No one ever proved it. June didn't care. She stopped looking over her shoulder. She'd already buried the man he sent. That was enough. The wedding was small. Ruth stood beside her. Silas stood waiting in the chapel doorway, his vest pressed, his collar crooked. The girls made flower crowns. One of them cried the whole way through. June wore a dress she'd sewn herself. Nothing white, just soft green, like new sage. Pure didn't matter. Alive did. Afterward, as the sun set over the hills, she stood outside the chapel with her husband's hand in hers. The girls ran circles around them, chasing fireflies. Ruth leaned on the rail, smiling despite her cane. June looked out across. The land, battered, burned, hers. She hadn't been saved. She'd saved herself, and now, finally, she was home.